You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin, Tony is with me, and we are here to cover everything from March 24th through April 6th. There was a bunch of stuff that happened over the past couple weeks. There's a lot of news specifically related to a lot of projects that have been picked up or projects that have been purchased. So if you're checking out the show notes, you'll find a lot of that stuff. But we're going to touch on the highlights from the past 2 weeks. There's a couple of different things that we're going to talk about. Some are bigger than others, and we also have a little bit of a discussion towards the end of the show. It's more of a discussion related to a hypothetical situation that could be brewing over at NBCUniversal / Comcast and the future of Peacock. There's two articles that specifically were touching on things about the future of Peacock, and I want to go into details about the realistic nature of those rumors. And then we also have a listener question, again, that we're going to round out the episode with. So let's get into some service updates. The first thing we've got is probably like on the fringe of what we would typically consider the streaming wars, specifically because it doesn't have to do with a streaming service per se, but it has to do with a cord cutting service, which we sometimes cover here on the show as well. But it was announced that T-Mobile is going to be shutting down their live TV streaming service, TVision, and instead they're going to be partnering with Philo and YouTube TV going forward to offer a live TV service through other providers. Now, what makes this slightly interesting is the fact that when they initially launched about 6 months ago, give or take, they were one of the least expensive options as far as cord cutting went. And while you didn't necessarily have the large selection that you would have if you had YouTube TV or Hulu Live or any of the other ones that are out there, it was very affordable. And I think a lot of people appreciated the fact that it was extremely affordable. But as it turns out, they also had a lot of problems initially when they launched about having access to specific channels. They were giving access to channels that they did not have direct deals in place to allow those channels to be used on their service. And there was a lot of disputes that kind of muddied the waters initially when they first launched. So while this isn't huge news, it's big news because there was just another thing just recently about AT&T, also a cell phone provider, and obviously they have other interests when it comes to cable television as well. They recently sold off a share of their Uverse TV, which was their cable brand, also their satellite, but also included in that was their streaming television service as well. So you can see that at least to some degree, it is not very profitable or not profitable enough for some of these larger telecommunication companies to get involved in that specific area of the industry. Next up, Disney Plus and ESPN Plus have launched officially on Comcast Xfinity X1 and Flex devices. All I have to say in regards to this is, why did it take so long? Obviously, there's the whole necessity of Disney and Universal being competition, but at the same time, Universal still has, or Comcast still has a slight hold on Hulu, so that could have been preventing that from happening. Maybe they were trying to work out a deal. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Disney Plus is obviously one of the fastest growing subscription services. So if they really wanted to have their devices being used for all streaming services that are out there, it would have made sense to get Disney Plus on there right away. But for some reason, it only took about a year and a half for them to roll that out, or I should say a little less than a year and a half, because the X1 device or the Flex devices have only been out for just over a year. But you can now access that content on your Comcast Flex and X1 devices.
Wow, that delay is pretty significant. I'm surprised that they finally made a deal at this point of time. Question, how much do you think that this is Disney not really making getting on Xfinity products a priority versus, Comcast kind of playing hardball, since that they are probably at the time when they started Disney Plus and ESPN Plus, trying to get those apps launched, they were creating their own streaming service.
I would sit here and say that it's, Disney there is no specific numbers on how many people are actually using the X1 devices or the Flex devices in comparison to some of the other ones. It doesn't even pop up as any sort of significant market share when you talk about streaming devices in general. But we know that cable boxes are an important way for consumers to use streaming services in general, because there has been such a big deal about the other cable companies and cable companies as a whole offering the streaming services available on their devices, specifically for the streaming services to basically have that immediate gateway into certain consumers' homes. Do I think that Disney didn't really make it a priority? I mean, that's entirely possible. I'm not sure. I feel like it would be more of a Comcast hardball thing, but I don't see how Comcast would benefit from keeping the service off, or both of the services off their device. They already had Hulu. I believe Hulu launched with it. And obviously they, like I said, they still have that little stake in Hulu for the time being, but it does come off as slightly strange that it took as long as it did. I mean, ESPN Plus, I could chalk it up to, well, they just didn't have the subscriber numbers until just recently because of the huge marketing push between the bundle. And then because they have such a larger subscriber count, maybe that's why that would be, that service would get focused on to be on the platform. But Disney Plus has been big since literally day one of its launch. So there's not a real reason for Disney Plus necessarily to insist that they have this on them. But I think it's more of Universal or Comcast playing hardball.
Yeah, I would agree. Just my experience of looking at, of reading and following Comcast over the years is they seem to be the obstinate partner in this relationship. So,
all right. So next up, this is an interesting one. Netflix has paid a reported $450 million for 2 Knives Out sequels. And if you're unfamiliar with Knives Out, it's a movie that came out at the end of 2019. It's a murder mystery. It did very well for what it was. It wasn't like a big blockbuster action movie. It had an ensemble cast of really great actors, but it was in most ways you could describe it as it's just a mid-range budget film. It was very down to earth. And it was very successful. Now, the real question is, and this has been presented online, is why in the world would they pay $450 million for 2 sequels? That's a lot of money. The other catch, of course, is that the first film, it was successful in the box office to a degree, but does it warrant, breaking up these 2 films as $225 million a piece? I'm not necessarily too sure on that. I mean, there's been not rumors, but there's been some talk online that maybe there's more to this purchase than meets the eye. Maybe there's 2 sequels, but they've also purchased the rights to a potential television series, and the movies will lead into a television series. But I don't know necessarily if that's true, because that's not part of the initial announcement. It's not, and you would think that it would be part of the initial announcement. It seems like a lot of money. I mean, we've heard some insanely large amounts of money being tossed around for certain movies when it comes to the streaming services. Netflix has been buying stuff all over the place, throwing, $50, $75 million at certain films that they make in-house. And then obviously there's been films that they've purchased, and other providers like Prime Video and things like that have provided, have bought films for $100 million, $120 million. There's a lot of money being thrown around, but $225 million per film is an insane amount of money, in my opinion. And I just don't see these films bringing in that significantly large amount of subscribers that's going to warrant necessarily the cost of these movies. I just feel like it's too high.
I agree. It is extremely high. The first Knives Out movie had a budget of $40 million, and its box office was, the final tally was $311 million. I love Knives Out. I think it's a great show. I was pleasantly surprised with the movie. It was of this weird genre. Basically, it's like the game Clue brought to life, and it was a pleasant experience. And after Rian Johnson, he has a little bit of controversy with the Star Wars fandom, and then he just comes out with this movie, and it was a nice breath of fresh air. a nice breath of fresh air. And I just really enjoyed this film and just the concepts behind that. I think moving forward and talking about this Netflix thing, yes, Knives Out, yes, made $311 million. It wasn't like a huge blockbuster, one of those big summer things. I think it came out in November United States, because we're always late. And, it was a fun, winter flick, made $311 million. I think, though, online, there's a lot of buzz about it. Online, there was a lot of talk about people watching it, enjoying it. I mean, critic response was like 97% on Metacritic or Rotten Tomatoes. There's a lot of buzz and hype about this movie, and that kind of fits what Netflix's model is of their TV shows. I mean, think about House of Cards, that blew up in a big, online presence of people talking about that, all this buzz and this hype. Same thing with Stranger Things, and we can keep going on with the different shows and properties. So from the quote unquote online hype aspect of Knives Out, I can definitely see how it would fit within Netflix, and with its production budgets of $40 million. You're basically just casting people in a house and maybe one explosion or two. Like, that's definitely a really good in their budget space. But $450 million, that is a little bit surprising. That's almost like Apple TV a little bit overpaying for a property. And I think it's because, and I think the article touches this a little bit, is that, if you look at how things are playing, Warner Media and HBO Max are dropping big theatrical blockbusters every single month. I mean, last week was just Godzilla versus Kong, or Kong versus Godzilla. It was a fantastic movie. Before that was Judas and the Black Messiah, and there's going to be ones in the future, right? Disney, they just did this Raya and the Last Dragon is theatrical, and then on the Premier Access, you could pay $30 for it as well. They're going to do the same thing with, Black Widow. So you're seeing this kind of trend of this mix between the theatrical big buzz things that are happening and the streaming services as well. And Netflix might be looking at it and just, okay, we're not as big as we are, and as much as we have accomplished, we are not in that space. We are not really fitting in there. And yes, they had Martin Scorsese film. Dustin, help me out. What was it? It was very well acclaimed.
Irishman.
Yeah, The Irishman. Very well acclaimed, but it didn't, I felt like, generate as much hype as maybe some of these other films and properties. So to me, this is like Netflix is paying for like one of those like buzz properties that can really generate online buzz, and to make them feel a little bit relevant in this big budget space. As much as I think Netflix has been successful, they haven't really done big budget films very well. Bright, I think that's what it was, with Will Smith. Did not do very well. There was a big budget movie with Ben Affleck recently, and that was kind of hit or miss. Yes, lots of people watched it, but it wasn't really critically acclaimed. So that to me is why Netflix is going after this. It's definitely shocking for them when they usually, yes, they might spend a lot of money, but it's because of they're spending it on a bunch of different projects or investing in a different space. But putting $450 million within one, franchise for two movies is very surprising. But maybe they're also trying to buy, in a sense, Rian Johnson and his work, and okay, like we like Knives Out, let's do 2 and 3, and then from there, like let's sign him to an exclusive deal or something like that. That might be the case. But I agree, Dustin. This is a very weird deal that's happening.
And honestly, is one of those things. Just when you think that Netflix couldn't throw, they're starting to understand that they don't need to spend an insane amount of money, they go and do this. And we know that in general, there is going to be this lull. There was just a report recently saying that Netflix is currently putting out about 12% less than they did last year as far as the amount of original content that they have. And that's specifically due to the fact that they just have COVID delays when it comes to filming things. And typically year over year, they actually increase. So you're seeing a 12% decrease from last year on top of the fact that you would typically have an increase. So you're saying, around 20% less than you would expect to find this year, in a pre-COVID world. And now we're sitting here seeing a situation where they don't have as much original content. So you would assume, yes, there's going to be some purchases. We've already heard about some smaller films that they've purchased that are going to be, joining the over 100 films that they're releasing over the course of the year. But this isn't even something that's going to be happening anytime soon. Rian Johnson specifically had a sequel that he stated was in mind, and that he was working on a sequel as of January of 2020. So sure, it could start filming soon, but we're not going to see the sequel in 2021. So I don't understand the necessity to spend that much money right now, unless there is the potential of a future, licensing deal when it comes to a television series or something like that, where they make 2 films with Daniel Craig, but then somehow it spins off into a television series that they could do for like 4 seasons and really keep the customers from churning out, basically. I just don't see a movies in general. They're great in bringing customers in initially, but you have to have other content and you have to spend money on the other content to really keep those customers from leaving the service after they watch the movie. And we're going to talk about Godzilla vs. Kong here in a second and some of the other films that have come out over the course of the last 6 months. They're doing great when it comes to like bringing customers in, but you really have to have like high quality content to keep customers coming back. Game of Thrones is touted as one of those series that, always brought in subscribers, but also would have good repeat viewings where people would come back and watch it again. You hear that with The Office and some of the other sitcoms of the 90s and early 2000s, like Friends and Big Bang Theory. Those are series that, those are great things that keep people around because there's just so many episodes. There's so many hours of content. And a movie itself, it's great, but once people watch it, how often are they going to go back and see it again? And this just seems like an exorbitant amount of money for something that they're not going to have a huge return on. They'll get some people to sign up. They'll have people watch the film, but it feels like these movie purchases are getting out of control, in my opinion.
Agreed. Just forgetting the price tag for a second, I think that actually Knives Out is a perfect fit on Netflix, given how the theatrical releases have been recently, unless it's like a big action or superhero flick. These other, movies that are in box office don't necessarily garner as much attention and love and earn as much profit as they did probably about 10 years before. So I can definitely see Knives Out being on Netflix actually is a pretty good match because it is basically Clue. Like I said, it's Clue in live action, the game Clue in live action. And, you're sitting at home watching it on Netflix. I could definitely see that being a better fit than maybe being on a theatrical release. So from a property fit with Netflix as a company, I feel like this is actually a really good fit.
I agree on that. I absolutely agree. I think that we've talked about this in the past when we've talked about movies and how those smaller to mid-range budget films that don't make a significant large amount of money in the box office, they're primed for heading over to streaming services. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future. All right. So next up we have, it's not really like huge news, but it was something I just wanted to bring up. So there was a show called The Right Stuff that premiered on Disney Plus last October. Originally, it was set to just be a show on National Geographic, the cable station. And when Disney Plus was announced, it was announced that that show was going to be coming over as an original scripted series, specifically coming from the National Geographic brand for Disney Plus. It ended up premiering last October. In the process of them getting a second season together, they were originally filming the first season in Florida. They ended up getting a huge tax break, one of the largest tax breaks, to move the production to California. And they were actually going to be getting, I think it was the second largest tax break of any TV series that has ever had a tax break when it comes to being filmed. So they were going to be moving. And then suddenly there was news that Disney Plus has decided they're not going to order a second season. Now, what makes this slightly newsworthy is there's two things. When you look at the original content that Disney Plus has had over the course of, let's say, basically the last year and a half since they launched, the original content they have is typically content that has one of their major brands, and it also has to do with something that they own and they're creating themselves. When you look at what has released, this is one of the few shows that's not actually made by Disney or ABC Television or any of the other subsidiaries of Disney in general. It's actually made by Warner Brothers Television, and it was bought for National Geographic and then obviously ported over to Disney Plus. So it didn't do very well. It also happens to be the first series that Disney Plus is canceling, which is interesting, but also Warner Brothers Television made it. And there was another series, The Diary of the Teenage President, that was actually made by CBS for Disney Plus. That one did get renewed, but it shows that when you hear these big headlines of, for example, Falcon Winter Soldier premiered in the last couple weeks, and when it premiered, they stated that it was the biggest premiere of any of the shows that they've had on Disney Plus, even more so than The Mandalorian. And the thing is, those shows are going to be basically the bread and butter to propel Disney Plus to continuously have more content. We're hearing more rumors about more Marvel shows. There's obviously a slew of Star Wars shows that are taking place within the Star Wars universe. There's a lot of content that's coming out of those top tier brands that are underneath Disney, where they're not going to necessarily need content like the right stuff. And I'm not going to say, like, I'm a huge NASA fan. I love space history and things like that, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense for something like this to be successful on a platform like Disney Plus. So there's a good chance that if you're a fan of it, it could end up somewhere else just because of those tax cuts that they were going to get for the second season. So there's a very good chance it could end up on a different service. But it is one of those things, when you look at Disney Plus, they are going to be focused on that franchise content because that's what's super successful for them. So then jumping into our next piece of news before we get to our discussion. So there's a couple of things that have happened over the past couple of weeks. One, Godzilla vs. Kong came out on HBO Max. HBO Max has stated that it was the largest ever streaming audience for any of the films that have released. That would include, obviously, Wonder Woman 1984, which came out back in December. That would also include Zack Snyder's Justice League, which obviously premiered just about 2 weeks prior to Godzilla vs. Kong, which were highly anticipated when it came to, fandoms, but Godzilla vs. Kong did extremely well. In addition to that, and this is probably the part that I think Hollywood people in general are very happy about, is that the film also did very well in the box office. It made over $50 million here domestically during the pandemic, when theaters are still limited to only 25% capacity in a lot of different areas. While they are open in, states like California and New York, they are still very limited on how many people can be. I personally went to see Godzilla vs. Kong in theaters, and any of the seats that were available were used, were bought and purchased by someone who was there to see the films. So it was good to see that people were back in theaters and things like that. But it also is helpful because it shows that in some ways there are certain analysts that are going to look at this and say, when you look at when you specifically look at a film dual releasing on a streaming service, having a huge audience, to the fact where it's the largest audience that the service has had up to this point for a movie release, but then you also have it doing very well, or not very well, because let's be honest, $50 million isn't a ton of money, but in a pre-pandemic situation, that movie could have made maybe $150 million domestically. But even a third of that with only 25% capacity is pretty good for considering there are obviously still people who are using the service to watch a film. Now, that's not to say that obviously films are going to be dual releasing, going forward, but it does show that there are still films, and there are films in general, that they could dual release if, especially like I was just saying, those mid-range budget films. Those films could end up as a dual release, because if they worked out a deal where they could release them on the streaming service, you get the people who are subscribed to the streaming service the ability to be able to watch it, but then the people who aren't subscribing, they could still go to the theaters and see it if they wanted to as well. I think there is that possibility. And then to basically go into that, Disney has their big films that were planned to come out. Black Widow, which was supposed to come out in May, and then Cruella. They've announced both of those films are going to have dual releases with the premiere access, and Black Widow has been shifted over to around the beginning of July, and Cruella is going to stay on Memorial Day weekend, but they're going to be releasing on Disney Plus in that premiere access as well as in theaters. And that is, of course, Warner Brothers took all that heat back in December when they announced the dual releases, and here we're having a Marvel film, which hypothetically could be making a lot of money if it was just in theaters, being released on Disney Plus as well, and you don't hear about the heat except for them getting a lot of pushback from the theaters, because it's not a likely situation. If someone wants to see it in theaters and they have the ability to, they can go to the theaters. But it is showing that, at least for the immediate future, this is going to be something that's going to be happening at other studios. And Warner Brothers, I guess, in some ways was just a little ahead of the curve and had to deal with the brunt of all of the pushback.
Yeah, man, there's a whole lot to discuss here. One, Godzilla vs. Kong. I grew up not really liking any of the kaiju stuff, but my dad kept trying to force me into it. I just didn't really agree. I didn't really like it so much. But recently, I knew that Godzilla and Kong was being released on HBO Max. Diving into that stuff even more, what a fun film. I think a dual release was really great for that type of film. It's a big action film. You have, Godzilla versus King Kong, a monkey versus a dinosaur. That's going to be great for live action. So obviously it makes sense from a fan engagement standpoint why you would do something like this. I looked up, I just Googled, Tenet's numbers. Tenet made overall domestically in the U.S. market, U.S. and Canada, $57.9 million. And that's over its whole entire lifespan of it being at a theater. And Godzilla vs. Kong has already basically crushed that. It's already 50 million within 1 or 2 weeks. So I think it goes to show that they're going to have to do a release. I think it also shows that maybe King Kong versus Godzilla is a more popular movie than Tenet. And, yes, Christopher Nolan is a great director, but his name couldn't get everybody back to the box office. A thing to note, though, is also, especially in the United States, and I know other countries are working on their vaccination plans, already, is that U.S. is vaccinate a lot of people, and there have been big pushes to get more people vaccinated. And so because of that, more people feel comfortable leaving their houses. It's also the summertime. People are getting a little antsy. Even looking at last summer coronavirus cases, yes, they were a whole lot, and we need to still keep on top of that. But you had more activity in the summertime because people can get outside and stuff like that. So I think that we are going to see some of these big budget releases that are in the summer, like Godzilla versus Kong, like the Black Widow movie that's going to be released, and other big budget ones that are happening this summer. They're going to draw a COVID, a pandemic significant box office number. And so that's going to be fun as well. To talk about mid-budget movies, I think if it was traditional pre-COVID stuff, I think mid-budget movies were going to be dead, they're going to die out on theaters, and just the way how things were looking out. But it's COVID, theaters are going to take what they're going to get. So and that's why I think that the dual releases are going to be good. I know there's been some pushback by AMC and some of the other big theater companies, but at the end of the day, that they're struggling. AMC was almost at the point of bankruptcy, but they worked out a deal to get around that. But the company itself and then their workers, they're struggling. So any deal I think is good for them. So I think it's good for everybody at the same time of this dual release concept. So overall, I think this is really cool. I'm curious to see how Disney's Black Widow is going to do, because it is $30 tier as well. So you already pay for a Disney Plus subscription, and then you have to pay an extra $30 for the premiere access. And okay, how does that? There was a little pushback for Mulan with that whole situation, but I know at the end of the day, the numbers wise, it was very profitable for Disney to do so. And so I'm curious how the numbers are going to pan out for Disney Plus and doing this big release of Black Widow. I'm also curious, what is the subscriber bump, the retention rate of the people who did subscribe for Godzilla versus Kong, how much of a boost that actually was to their bottom line, to the subscriber count, all that type of stuff. So it's interesting to see, yes, I agree that Warner Media and HBO Max were, heavily ridiculed at the very beginning for this dual release strategy, but yet you're seeing other companies, adopting that. And it's not necessarily because of just they have to dump the content, because they've been holding it on for so long that they need to just release it just to get some positive return on their investment. But it's the fact of, I think the audiences really enjoy just having this option of either staying in or going to a theater and having that experience. It's just funny how we're starting to see more more streaming services move in that direction with Paramount Plus. Yeah, Godzilla versus Kong. Man, that started a whole big discussion.
All right, so now we're going to move into our main discussion, which is specifically some rumors that have popped up. And I'm sure in some ways there are some truth to these rumors, but we're going to talk about them with a disclaimer that they are rumors just for now. So the first report, they both have to do with each other, but I'm going to bring them up in two different parts because one kind of deals with the other when you think about it. So the first report came out, there was a report that came out from Business Insider that basically stated that NBCUniversal CEO Jeff Shell has been recently discussing the potential for a new subscription service that would be Universal branded, under the rationale that while Peacock is a recognizable brand in America, it is not as familiar worldwide. If this may sound familiar, it's probably because that's exactly what just happened with CBS All Access and Paramount Plus. CBS All Access was extremely recognizable here in the United States, and they rebranded to Paramount Plus because, what do you know, Paramount is more recognizable when it comes to other areas of the world. So this isn't that big of a surprise. However, when Peacock was launching, and they made a big deal about how their focus was on this service. They had no desire to do anything else. And that's not to say that obviously things couldn't change. There's been a lot of time that has shifted from when they initially had that investor summit in January of 2019 or January of 2020. And now there's obviously been time that has passed. They can see what does well and what doesn't. The idea of them creating let's just say a larger, more broad streaming service is something that they should have considered doing in the initial beginning. I'm not sure why in the world they thought they were going to be able to compete with the likes of Netflix or Prime Video or even HBO Max or specifically Disney Plus if they were only focused on the United States, because you could take any of these streaming services that have only been available here in the United States and know that the only time that they can be really successful is they figure out a way to get into other international markets. There's way more money involved in having this or making this service successful. Yes, by having it go international, but there's also that potential of having a lot more money when you enter those international markets. First up, let's just talk about the idea of whether or not a Universal branded service makes sense, knowing that Peacock at this point hasn't even been out for a year.
Short answer, no, it does not make sense. Oh, man. Okay, long answer. I don't understand. The only company... So yes, you gave CBS and Paramount Plus example. I think the difference there is that yes, CBS was its own thing, and yes, CBS is primarily known in the United States because it's one of the big news organizations. But with the rebranding to Paramount Plus, you actually got more content. You had a better integration with all the Paramount back logo libraries and stuff like that. So that to me was a good rebranding. It made sense. You're seeing this concept of I kind of take that as an outlier. The CBS Paramount Plus example is an outlier. I think a more direct comparison would be what you're seeing Disney do with Hulu and Star. But, Hulu has been around for a very long time. Like, they inherited Hulu. They bought Fox. They bought out Comcast. So they now have this product of Hulu, which I really much love, but it's been established for a very long time, and there wasn't really a big international audience for it. So if it's been around for a couple years and international audience is not interested in it, you probably need to do some rebranding or changing the service a little bit to accommodate that. So that's why I understand the Star, and then trying to integrate Hulu and Disney Plus together at some point in the future. You gotta do some magic there. So as much as the Star thing is kind of confusing for me and I kind of don't like it, but that's the direction that Disney has to go. Now in Universal, Peacock was not a recognizable name, a year ago? Like, no one ever associated Peacock, the name Peacock, with anything related to Disney Plus. I mean, to NBC. That's maybe just my take on it. Just no one knew about it. There was no correlation. So this idea of this rebranding just so that it's more appealing to the international market because they never heard of Peacock. Like, no one's heard of Peacock. I don't get it. I don't understand why they would do this. Just push Peacock harder. If you want your service to have more international presence, then just push it more. It's been 1 year. How do you even... it takes iteration. It takes growth. You push in one direction, you learn something, then you go in another direction, you learn something else and adapt. Each individual international market is very different. So just because you're trying to get in place A doesn't necessarily mean that strategy is going to work for place B. So it's been 1 year. Why are you going to launch another service? Why are you going to create customer confusion? And that's probably even worse than having a bad service, is confusing customers. So why would you have two different products that reaches one internationally and one domestic when you could just have one service and just do a better job of branding it either in the United States or elsewhere? Because you're going to pay for two different teams. You're going to probably have to deal with, you're starting another service. You have all the technical work to start another service, even if they're sharing, the back catalog at some points, right? You got to also, if it's another streaming service and that's its own brand, then you got to negotiate deals with not just, Peacock related content and, making sure stuff is on Peacock, but now making sure that stuff is going to be on this new streaming service. And that's just another organization that's got to do paperwork. Like, the point is, it's why. That's my thing. We haven't talked about this before the air, but I have a feeling that Dustin, you're just kind of at the same point of just, why are they doing this? Why would they even entertain after it being, less than a year? Oh, let's launch another service when you just launched one. Like, let's just see how it goes. Why change?
Yeah, I am in the exact same boat. I'm not saying that they shouldn't think about some way of expanding internationally in some way. And I do agree that the Universal name is obviously going to be much more well known than the Peacock brand of NBC. But when you look at the comparison between like CBS All Access and Paramount Plus, or switching over to Paramount Plus, they added a lot of content that was available on other stations. They added content from Nickelodeon because that was part of the Viacom CBS merger that they had. They were able to add Nickelodeon content. They were able to add content from BET and Comedy Central and MTV and all these other channels that that were part of that merger. So CBS All Access existed for a significant amount of time. Let's be clear, it was successful by itself and probably plateaued to a point where they realized it wasn't going to go any bigger here in the United States. So they decided they needed to make sure that they could get into an international market, and that's why it rebranded. But that service was around for a long time before it rebranded. The idea of Peacock potentially either standing alone as its own service and them creating a brand new service specifically for the international market just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I really don't like the idea that Disney did that with Star, specifically because instead of figuring out a way to incorporate the Hulu content, that the content that is available on Hulu here in the United States into Disney Plus, to make it an all-inclusive service that includes all this content that in most cases a lot of people are bundling together anyway. Instead of figuring that out, they've just decided, well, we're going to focus that on the international market. And let's be clear, I'm convinced that the whole reason behind that is to make sure that the cost or the value of Hulu does not rise over time, because we all know that Comcast has a specific deal in place to have Disney buy out the remaining stake in Hulu. And if Hulu's value goes really high, Disney's going to have to pay a lot more money. So they've decided to use Star as their substitute for Hulu when it comes to every market except for the United States. I don't really like that at all. I think that branding wise, it does not benefit the company to have multiple services that do the exact same thing in different markets. I just don't feel like that's entirely necessary. For a brand perspective, you want everything to be under the same thing. And maybe that's, long term, that might be what Disney's planning on doing. Maybe Disney's plan is to eventually, once Comcast is not in the picture with Hulu, they can take care of, integrating it all and having Hulu as part of Disney Plus. And they're just waiting for that deal to run out with Comcast. That could be the case. But when it comes to Comcast or NBCUniversal specifically going and creating another platform to have to basically take it to the international markets, I think it's a horrible idea. Now, the end of the article specifically talks about how Business Insider suggested that they have other avenues of bringing more money in, which is to keep their licensing deals, just basically eliminating their licensing deals. We've heard this before. There's always this always comes up when it comes to the specific films and TV shows. Once you bring your content back in-house and you're licensing it basically in-house from the production company that created it for the distributor that was originally the distributor for it, you're going to, it's just more beneficial for you. You have more growth. Potentially the cost is less. We saw this with Friends. Friends was on Netflix. It was being licensed by Netflix from Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers, they wanted it for their own service. So they brought it over to HBO Max. Big Bang Theory didn't have a streaming deal in place. Instead, they came over to HBO Max when HBO Max launched. We see this with The Office. Peacock bringing The Office and Parks and Rec back to their own service with Peacock, specifically so that they can have the content and they're foregoing the licensing deals of making these licensing fees that they get from having this content go elsewhere. However, the suggestion from Business Insider is, well, Peacock, if they wanted to grow, they could just make sure that their licensing deals that they have in place with Netflix and HBO Max, or HBO and obviously HBO Max because of how that's all situated, but they could end those deals and they could bring the content directly back to Peacock. However, I don't think that NBCUniversal is big enough and has enough content to basically lose those licensing deals and not have the money coming in from them. I don't think that Peacock, especially without the ability to have an international reach, has the potential to be profitable to bring that in. Let's also keep in mind that they've been spending money on sports rights too. They're trimming things out of what they have, like they're shutting down NBC Sports Network. They're going to be concentrating some of their efforts on other things. They just brought in WWE Network and spent an insane amount of money to bring all of that stuff into Peacock. So I don't think it's such a great idea for them to do that. The other article that I linked in the show notes specifically about this is talking about how they could pull their content from other services. It's diving a little bit more into that focus, but it has to do with the same thing. Universal movies are currently being licensed out to Netflix and HBO. And those movies, when they come out of theaters, they go through their certain window of being available only at retailers on physical or digital methods. Then they end up either at Netflix or HBO for a certain level of time. And I distinctly remember during the investor summit, they said they had no intention at the time, obviously at the time because things change, but they had no intention of ending deals with HBO or Netflix for the licensing that they had in place for that content. Now, there's also a rumor specifically stating that when those deals run out with Netflix and HBO, maybe they put in a deal where they can have joint custody, essentially, of these projects. So they could put it on Peacock, but also they would still get some money from being able to put that content on HBO or Netflix, and they just split it. And I think that's possible because we've already seen that happen with a show like Modern Family, which is owned by Disney. It's on Peacock, also on Hulu. There was a deal that they split. And I think that is possible. It's a way for certain streaming services to get a better deal. And then a service like Peacock that doesn't have the subscriber counts necessarily that a service obviously like Netflix or potentially in the future like HBO Max, they can save some money on the licensing of that content, but also Peacock can have some content for the subscriber base that they have. How it's going to grow if they do that, I don't see that happening at all.
I love how you basically just said that content is basically these two companies, the streaming services, are going to have to go to family court to figure out custody rights of the different properties. Dustin, we mentioned a while back, probably maybe a year ago. Man, it's been a year ago, how yes, like exclusive content is important. The Office and Friends and other shows like that being on certain services is very important. But we also understood that companies can make money, a lot of money, just by having their stuff licensed out to different platforms. And I think that one of the things that we push on the show is, yes, you need these big name shows, but you also just need other content that you can watch. And an easy way to do this is just, license out your content. You can get that static revenue from somewhere else because the other people are going to watch it. They have the same problem of they just need stuff from their catalog. You can get that revenue. If it's not that important, then yeah, put it on your platform, put it on theirs, get some money from both, and everybody kind of wins in that scenario. But then you keep the ones that are going to really drive people on your service. Now, this is more me being, this is my best guess. This isn't anything empirical at all. I have no backing here, but kind of in the vein of like the Pareto rule, which is like the 80-20 rule. I have a feeling that 80% of the traffic is probably created by 20% of the content on these streaming services. So some of the big names are really going to drive the content. They're going to get people really involved. And that's where 80% of the time and attention goes. But then you have this other 20% of content, the other 20% of the time, which is filled by this other 80% of content. So there's a whole sea of content out there that you just need to have that are going to keep people interested, but people are really going to be focused on a few core shows, a few core things over time. And you just have this other content that just kind of sits in the background. So with that frame in mind, every streaming service needs to have content, background content. And these deals are going to help that to happen. So to bring it back to Comcast and Peacock and Universal, it depends on the movie. It really does depend on the movie. Some movies are going to really, if you have them on your service, it's going to be a bigger boost than if you have them, licensed out. And it might just be that some properties you just keep licensed out because they weren't that big of a hit. Just because it's exclusive doesn't necessarily mean it's the best decision business-wise. Exclusive sounds really good and sounds really, flashy of, okay, we have all this exclusive content. But, from a bottom line, like you need the dollars. That's kind of how I view it. Exclusive does not necessarily mean it's a better deal for the business. Comcast, they have a lot to figure out. And, yes, some things might be best still on Netflix and getting, that revenue that Netflix generates from it. Or you could put it on your own service and potentially, bolster growth. It doesn't have to be like a zero-sum game exclusionary of either this or this service or this service. It can be on both. I don't think that they should pull all their content. They need to analyze, okay, which is the best, put it on their own service, make it exclusive, and the other, whatever it is. Okay, so that's kind of addressing the whole bigger point. But to bring it back to the point that we just talked about from them launching their own streaming service, yeah, you could view that this move and these talks of pulling all the Universal content from Netflix and probably other places would prime the pump for an exclusive for a like Universal branded streaming service. I just don't understand why they can't just put that on Peacock, you know? Like if they were to do this and make everything, you know, all their content go back onto streaming, they get back the streaming rights to all their content. Just put it on Peacock and then just push Peacock, you know? You don't have to make another service called like Universal. So yeah, that's kind of addressing those points right there.
All right, so to round up the episode, we're going to read a listener question. They specifically said, what is your opinion on Marvel on Disney Plus? Because already WandaVision and Falcon and Winter Soldier has been some of their biggest shows, and way more is coming. This brings in loads and loads of subscribers to Disney Plus. Do you think without Marvel, Disney Plus would not be as good and have as many subscribers? I have a very simple response to this, which is I do believe that obviously Marvel is driving people to subscribe to Disney Plus. They are, and there's going to be tons of more Marvel content. I mentioned it earlier when we were talking about Disney Plus content in general. There's going to be a lot more content that comes from those key franchises, Marvel, Star Wars, Pixar, those key franchises that Disney has basically acquired over the past 20 years, because those are the things that are really bringing in more and more subscribers, because they have the ability to basically take something that was, you know, like in some ways a singular story. Star Wars, you know, you've got the first original trilogy from the 70s, which was just telling a story. And yeah, there was a cartoon and there was a couple of TV specials or some, you know, films that were, you know, some side films and stuff that were made. But for the most part, it was telling a single story. But the universe is so large that they can expand and tell so many more stories when given the resources to do it. And Disney Plus, in a lot of ways, is giving those places, those franchises, the ability to basically create larger stories on a smaller scale where they can expand the universe and focus on so many. I mean, obviously, when there was that first initial push of Marvel shows on Netflix, everybody was thrilled. The idea of these Marvel TV shows that were going to kind of build universe within Marvel outside of the films. And while it didn't really connect to the films all that much, the idea of like building this interconnected universe of shows, but now with the ability with Disney Plus to have that interconnected group of shows also tie into movies, have them like basically referencing each other, it's huge. You're going to see the same thing with the Star Wars franchise. So do I think that specifically if Marvel wasn't at Disney Plus would be as big as it is? Yeah, I do. Because honestly, when you look at WandaVision and Falcon and Winter Soldier, while they're both successful shows on the platform, Disney Plus was successful before they even had any Marvel shows. They just had Marvel films. You know, they had a library of Marvel films that were available on the service, but they were still doing extremely well before the very first Marvel show launched. I do believe that Marvel will help Disney Plus continue to it'll keep that churn down, and that has a lot to do with the fact that they have these huge popular franchises that they can basically, in some ways, mine them for as much as they want, as long as they've got good stories to tell and they do a good job of producing the content based around those franchises. That content will just keep flowing and flowing and flowing, and when a series gets old or stale, they can immediately just go to another corner of the universe. And I think that's going to continue to help the service succeed well into the future. Obviously, there's a reason why we've heard there's like 11 shows or projects for Star Wars, and there's like 15 something projects for Marvel. It's because that stuff is the top tier stuff. Those films generate billions of dollars in the box office. The shows are going to generate people subscribing in large numbers, and that's going to be huge for the service.
I think short answer to directly answer this is Disney Plus would be fine. These Marvel shows have been a big hit for them. Definitely WandaVision so far has garnered a lot of, social media acclaim. People are talking about it, the buzz. $10. I'm going to bet that WandaVision gets some awards because Elizabeth Olsen was just fantastic in that show, and she just very diverse range. Very emotional in certain parts, and it was just overall great writing. So yeah, that's the short answer. I think if we were to look at this problem question more holistically, and focus, okay, how would Disney be without the purchases they made in the recent years? So, okay, Pixar, even ESPN, Marvel, Star Wars, and I think the Fox acquisition, I'm going to include that as well. Yes, Disney always has, these original characters, and they've done their best. They've earned a lot of money for the company. So if you were going to launch a streaming service with just that, it would be kind of a kid show, a kid service. There would be a lot of content there, but and there's another podcast acquired. They broke down like different acquisitions, and they were talking about how Bob Iger was looking at Disney and all these different moves that he was making, and all bringing to the point of he was buying franchises. If you look at Pixar, it's a company, and it was really great animation, really pushed Disney, and then just to step up the game. But there are a lot of franchises that Pixar had, and that Disney bought Pixar, and then now they acquired those franchises, and now they can extend the different series or just do a spin-off from a character, all that type of stuff. Marvel, they bought a whole lot of content. They bought Marvel. They bought Marvel, and Marvel Comics. I mean, that company has been around for just so many years, and all the characters and all the stories that are there probably will take 50 years maybe to produce all that content, and that's just even pushing it. So they bought a franchise. They bought something that can self-sustain, that can create more content by itself, even before they run out. So that's what that is. Star Wars, you're basically buying a concept. Like, yes, you did buy, the original trilogy. You did buy, the Clone Wars animated TV show. You did buy the old release of like the Ewoks and stuff like that. You bought a universe that could tell endless stories. And there's so many stories from the expanded universe that fans want to see. And you could take elements of that and incorporate it in itself. So if you look at Disney and look at where they've been and how they've taken the steps to get from where they were to where they are now, they bought specific different franchises. That's how I look at Disney, and it's a little bit different from other companies, just since that Disney did do so many different acquisitions, and their content acquisitions. They're buying companies for their content, and sometimes like for the engineers or the team. Really, it's for content. So if you were to take Marvel or Star Wars or Pixar away from like Disney as a company, then yes, Disney Plus would suck as a service. But since they made these moves, hindsight, you could probably say Iger was a genius, but they did these moves before Disney Plus launched, and they started out with the fantastic show, The Mandalorian, that just got a whole lot of adults into the show, and then you had the big staple of kids content. That's what propelled the streaming service to move forward. And I am very glad that the Marvel content is being created right now, because for a while there was a lot lacking in terms of adult content. You had The Mandalorian end, you maybe had Hamilton, and then you waited for the next Mandalorian season. And so Marvel shows are necessary to keep kind of the adult audience, satiated. If they didn't have that, that would be a big issue for Disney Plus. Now you could just replace it with other Star Wars content or something like that, but you just needed something to fill that time gap. So that's why the Marvel shows are important. But really, Disney is built on different franchises, and that's what they've been acquiring over the past few years, and that's kind of their business model. So if you take any one of them out, Disney is going to be weaker. Disney Plus would suffer. So that's kind of like a taking it one step further of, okay, how would Disney Plus be if you took out kind of one of these big franchises acquisitions from over the years?
All right, so with that is going to wrap up this episode of the Streaming Wars. I want to encourage everybody to check out the show notes that we have on our website, thestreamingwars.io, for all of the articles that we talked about here, and then obviously everything else that has happened in the world of streaming over the past 2 weeks. You can also follow us on YouTube, and we have playlists on our channel that are linked to all of the latest trailers for all of the various streaming services that are available, and there's tons of trailers that are constantly releasing, so you can actually subscribe to those playlists, and then you will be able to see the new trailers as they release, as we update those playlists with the new offerings from the various different streaming services. You can follow us on Twitter. You can also follow us on Instagram for all these announcements related to new episodes of the podcast posting. We also have a Discord that you can find links to all three of those over on our website, thestreamingwars.io. You can also send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, or topics you'd like us to discuss on future episodes. We're always looking for feedback, so wherever you're listening to this podcast, please consider leaving feedback. That is always greatly appreciated. With all that being said, for Tony and myself, this has been the Streaming Wars, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.